All right, everyone. So we're on to 9.5, and this is going to be calls to reform and responses. So this is something that's going to happen in the wake of World War II, some of them, even before then, 1900 to today, and many of these movements still exist. There's also a lot of things that are going on during the century: decolonization, a call for more freedoms and rights, self-determination. A lot of these movements are going to go alongside with events in the world that we've already talked about. So keep that very much in mind. So, to what extent have social roles and practices changed since 1900? That is our essential question for today. And so, as we go through examples, think about to what extent they have changed the social roles and some of the practice that we've had. So, 9.5, the rights based discourse challenged old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. We're going to talk more in detail about some of these things that occur, but the first one here, the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights. And the United Nations was established in 1945, right after World War II, and it was an attempt to replace what was the League of Nations with a little bit more oomph into it. And at the same time, one of the big things that they promoted was the idea of human rights. And in 1948, they established something called the Human Declaration for Human Rights. And the Declaration for Human Rights establishes that no matter what you would categorize yourself as a person and such, no matter what your race, gender, language, nationality, political association, social classes, whatever, all humans, regardless of those factors, are entitled to these basic rights. And so the little chart here does have some examples. You have the right to education. You have the right to fair and public trial. You have the right to not be tortured. And there's a whole bunch here you can put down as far as examples of the basic human rights that all people should have. And doing this establishment, it does challenge a lot of the practices and things that occur in different cultures around the world. And so this basically universalizes what is considered a human right. And so when countries divert from these rights, then it's up to the international community to put pressure on the regimes of those countries to change their ways. And that's where the United Nations can be effective, is trying to promote human rights around the world. They also established the International Court of Justice, and for them, it's found in The Hague in the Netherlands. It is a court in which they will put people on trial for crimes against humanity when people have violated these basic human rights. Some of the examples that you may know is what happened in Yugoslavia, when the breakup of Yugoslavia, and you had all these ethnic violence that was going on and such. One of the leaders of Serbia, the president of Serbia, is a guy named Slobodan Milosevic, and he was put on trial for crimes against humanity because he was linked to some of the ethnic cleansing that was occurring during those Yugoslav wars. And so, he's an example in recent history of people who have gone to the International Court of Justice for crimes against humanity. So we also have this massive global feminist movement around the world, and it's not just in Western European or United States and Canada and such. It's a global movement to various degrees of success of gaining more rights for women, political, social, economic rights, and it's something that's still very much a work in progress. And so during this time period, there's a lot of challenge to the patriarchal order that has been around for a very long time. And, we only started history at 1250 or 1200. And, even going back before that, well before that, all the way to the Neolithic Revolution and the Agricultural Revolution, there's always been this general inequality and patriarchy where men are the inheritors of wealth and land and of political power, positions of power and things like that. Women have not had the same equality for a very, very, very long time. And even today, it's, much better than what it has been in the past, but there's still a lot of progress to be made. So I put on a little timeline, some major events in the global feminist movement. March 1911, the first International Women's Day celebration. June 1975, they had the UN's World conference on women and so forth. The one I definitely want to highlight more so than others is 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And when they met together, they established a basic women's Bill of Rights, much of which was adopted by the United Nations. The right to hold office and to vote, the right to freely choose a spouse, which, for long times in history and lots of different cultures, marriages have been arranged. And so that is, an important thing to note, that women should have the right to choose who their spouse is. The right to equal education, the right to family planning and resources, and for things like birth control. Those are basic rights that they believe that all women should have, and that's something that is a fight that continues around the world today. To various degrees of success. The most recent kind of event that part of the global feminist movement was the Women's March of January of 2017. And it happened the day after President Trump was inaugurated, probably for a reason, but it was done. Like they called for a large march on Washington, but the marches occurred across the country. They occurred across the world. There were marches in Europe and Africa and Asia. So then, this whole global feminist movement is not just something that happens in individual countries. It is a global thing, and women are trying to make their voice be heard more so on issues that affect them, the family, and so forth. And they want to make sure that they have an equal say in what happens in the world and that we shape today. Another example is the Negritude Movement, which started in French West Africa and originally was kind of part of a movement to reject colonialism as well as promote self-determination. But a big takeaway from it was the promotion of the pride in being Black. And, that Black people around the world have a unique culture, a unique sense of history, and a whole bunch of other things. And I would not really call it a Black nationalist movement, more of an intellectual movement to promote, Black culture, Black intellectualism, and so forth. And so it does end up becoming a major movement that influences other things in the world. Example, Harlem Renaissance, which you'll learn more about in APU's history during the 1920s and 30s. You have a huge cultural movement that's promoting like pride being, having Black pride and such, and poetry, music, a lot of the culture, and a lot of the poems and writings and such about what it's like to be Black, taking pride in that sense. So there's a lot of things that you can really put into that, the Harlem Renaissance as having major influences. And of course, the Black Pride movement in the 60s and 70s, kind of alongside with the Civil Rights movement and such. A lot of those have roots in many of the stuff that goes on with the Negritude movement. So that is something that is noteworthy as far as challenges to old systems, where they are challenging the notion that Black people are somehow less so than other races and such. Something that was viewed as a kind of a popular opinion of the earlier periods of history. They're challenging that notion and taking pride in their own cultural identity as well. So liberation theology is another one of these movements challenging social orders, especially in Latin America. And this theory is going to combine some of the ideas of socialism and Catholicism, where much of the beliefs is that Jesus, many of his teachings were about helping the poor, lifting up your fellow man, things like that. And the ideas of that kind of get mixed in with socialism. And so the promotion of more social equality within society, and calling for a massive redistribution of wealth, take from the wealthy class landowners and such, and more equally distribute amongst the working poor people and countries. And there's various degrees of success. It was very influential in a lot of different areas. In Honduras, there was a uprising to remove a dictator, and much of the uprising was promoted the ideas of the liberation theology. They put in place a socialist government reflecting much of those ideas. Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who became to power in the early 2000s, was heavily influenced by the liberation theology, and he's going to establish more um, social programs and such to try to redistribute wealth to various degrees of success. Most people will say, well, Venezuela is a mess today, and that's I'm not going to argue against that, but it's more complicated than just the establishment of social practices. There's a lot of other things that have occurred in Venezuela to lead to the terrible situation that occurs on in that country. And then Pope Francis, who is was a cardinal in Argentina, and he was heavily influenced by the liberation theory and theology himself. And the official stance of the Catholic Church was very much against the liberation theology. But when he became Pope, he ends up lifting that condemnation against this theology. So. All right, so moving on, in much of the world, access to education as well as participation in new political and professional roles became more inclusive in terms of race, class, gender, and religion. So let's talk about a little bit of that. So when gender equality, there's a lot of things, and I don't want to make our lecture too long because we are getting towards the end of the year and such. But gender equality, like women's rights, has been a big issue. And we talked about the global feminist movement. Lots of women's rights milestones have been met during this map up here. You can see there's a lot of the states and states women's rights in different countries. The earliest ones United States 1920 was 1920, but a lot of them around the world. There's been global movement given more political equality, but much more progress in what so you still have this past week, so the country never had been united in the world. Will not be this year. So there is still like a lot of equality that and then there is 77 countries. So there's still steps towards gender equality in some aspects, but there's still making more. The racial equality as well is a major step from all the world. So there's still like there's kind of forward at the end of the caste system, but even when you would think usually not there's also going to be calls on forums and movements to try to help basically let those but globalization happens by environmental impact, social impact, so there will be mobilization of people protesting and calling for so responsibility and environmental issues, especially environmental increase environmental awareness by Youth movement on birthday. When I was a kid, every year our class in elementary school on Earth Day would go out and plant a tree in the schoolyard and such. And I wonder if it's still there. But things like that were promoting education of environmental issues on Earth Day. You also have environmental activism that occurs, Greenpeace, which I'll talk about in the next couple slides. The Extinction Rebellion is going to be something that basically it's a movement that's is trying to bring more awareness to the issues of global catastrophe that is potential with global warming and such. They're a little more extreme. They in London, a bunch of the protesters laid down the streets to stop people to moving traffic and things like that. Like a way to try to stop them from continuing to burn fossil fuels or something like that. So, their movement's relatively new on the scene, but they're worth noting. And then Greta Thunberg, who a lot of people know who she is. She was kind of 15 when she came onto the scene and came to the United Nations and basically told them, if you say your children are the most important thing to you, then why are you leaving them a world in which their environment's going to be trashed and they're not going to be able to survive and live good lives without taking action on global warming today. So she's a very popular figure in the environmental activism movements, and so I thought it was worth mentioning her as well. All right, so the first are Wangari Maathai's Green Belt movement in Kenya, and so this movement itself, it's a indigenous grassroots movement. It has no government involvement whatsoever, and so the idea was, and this is going on in Kenya, is to build or to plant more and more trees, and for sustainability of the environment, and also to try to stop the spread of the Saharan desert southward, because with global warming there is more desertification that's occurring. So she's kind of started this movement of environmental conservation, planting more trees and using finding sustainable ways to balance living with the environment without destroying the environment as well. So it's a pretty impressive movement, and it's one that occurs in Kenya and is spreading in other parts of the world as well. Greenpeace is environmental activists. They are focused on worldwide issues when it relates to environmental, so climate change, deforestation, overfishing, commercial whaling, genetic engineering, and anti-nuclear issues and such. So they're pretty, I don't say extreme, but they are aggressive. in their methods to try to stop, certain companies from exploiting the earth and such. People know them a lot for trying to stop commercial whaling, where whaling still occurs in some countries still. Fish, is fish the right word? They kill whales and such for quote unquote research purposes, and there are activists who get on boats and they try to stop them. I think they made a show about it on TV. Couldn't tell you too much more about that, but I've seen clips of it. But anyway, that's Greenpeace for you, and they, are major activists and have been for a long time to try to, get companies to stop polluting and things like that. All right, and then there's also organizations that are going to try to promote more fair trade practices and stopping the exploitation of workers and the environment as well. So. The World Fair Trade Organization, not to be confused with the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is associated with 401 organizations, and then they basically are committed to trying to improve the livelihoods of economical marginalized producers, basically trying to stop the exploitation of workers, because we talked about globalization and how companies will take factory and manufacturing this is trying to promote, paying people fair wages for fair work and good working conditions. And so they basically have 10 major principles that they try to adhere by, which you can see in the slide here. But, things like fair pay, no child labor, better working conditions, transparency and accountability by the companies, and respect for the environment. All of these are things that they try to promote around the world. All right, so that's it for this one. To what extent have social roles and practices changed since 1900? So make sure you take some time to respond to it in Canvas. And that's it for now. I will be back for 9.6, which should be lit later today.